The Life of Themistocles by Plutarch. Themistocles came of a family too obscure to entitle him to distinction. His father, Neocles, was a middle-class Athenian citizen, of the township of Phryre and the tribe Leontes. He was base-born on his mother's side, as the epigram tells us. My name's a Brotnon from Thrace. I boast not old Athenian race. Yet, humble though my lineage be, Themistocles was born of me. Phanias, however, says that the mother of Themistocles was a Chian, not a Thracian, and that her name was not a Brotnon but Euterpe. Manthus even tells us that she came from the city of Halicarnassus in Caria. All base-born Athenians were made to assemble at Kainosarges, a gymnasium outside the walls sacred to Heracles, who was regarded as base-born among the gods because his mother was a mortal, and Themistocles induced several youths of noble birth to come to Kainosarges with him and join in the wrestling there, an ingenious device for destroying the exclusive privileges of birth. But, for all that, he evidently was of the blood of Lycomedes, for when the barbarians burned down the temple of the initiation at Phlyra, which belonged to the whole race of the descendants of Lycomedes, it was restored by Themistocles, as we are told by Simonides. He is agreed by all to have been a child of vigorous impulses, naturally clever, and inclined to take an interest in important affairs and questions of statesmanship. During his holidays and times of leisure he did not play and trifle as other children do, but was always found arranging some speech by himself and thinking it over. The speech was always an attack on, or a defense of, some one of his playfellows. His schoolmaster was wont to say, "You will be nothing petty, my boy, you will be either a very good or a very bad man." In his learning, he cared nothing for the exercises intended to form the character, and mere showy accomplishments and graces, but eagerly applied himself to all real knowledge, trusting to his natural gifts to enable him to master what was thought to be too abstruse for his time of life. In consequence of this, when in society he was ridiculed by those who thought themselves well-mannered and well-educated, he was obliged to make the somewhat vulgar retort that he could not tune a lute or play upon the harp, but he could make a small and obscure state great and glorious. In spite of all this, Stesimbrotus says that Themistocles was a pupil of Anaxagoras, and attended the lectures of Melissus the physicist, but here he is wrong as to dates. Melissus was the general who was opposed to Pericles, a much younger man than Themistocles, when he was besieging Samos, and Anaxagoras was one of Pericles' friends. One is more inclined to believe those who tell us that Themistocles was a follower and admirer of Mnesiphilus of Phryre, who was neither an orator nor a natural philosopher, but a man who had deeply studied what went by the name of wisdom, but was really political sharp practice and expedients of statesmanship, which he had, as it were, inherited as a legacy from Solon. Those who in later times mixed up this science with forensic devices, and used it, not to deal with the facts of politics, but the abstract ideas of speculative philosophy, were named sophists. Themistocles used to converse with this man when he had already begun his political career. In his childhood he was capricious and unsteady, his genius, as yet untempered by reason and experience, showing great capacities both for good and evil, and after breaking out into vice, as he himself used afterwards to admit, saying that the colts which are the hardest to break in usually make the most valuable horses when properly taught. But as for the stories which some have fabricated out of this, about his being disinherited by his father, and about his mother committing suicide through grief at her son's disgrace, they seem to be untrue. On the other hand, some writers tell us that his father, wishing to dissuade him from taking part in politics, pointed out to him the old triremes lying abandoned on the beach, and told him that politicians, when the people had no farther use for them, were cast aside in like manner. Very early in life Themistocles took a vigorous part in public affairs, possessed by vehement ambition. Determined from the very outset that he would become the leading man in the state, he eagerly entered into all the schemes for displacing those who were then at the head of affairs, especially attacking Aristides, the son of Lysimachus, whose policy he opposed on every occasion. Yet his enmity with this man seems to have had a very boyish commencement, for they both entertained a passion for the beautiful Stesilaus, who, we are told by Ariston the philosopher, was descended from a family residing in the island of Chios. After this difference they espoused different parties in the state, and their different temper and habits widened the breach between them. Aristides was of a mild and honorable nature, and as a statesman cared nothing for popularity or personal glory, but did what he thought right with great caution and strict rectitude. He was thus often brought into collision with Themistocles, who was trying to engage the people in many new schemes, and to introduce startling reforms, by which he would himself have gained credit, and which Aristides steadily opposed. He is said to have been so recklessly ambitious and so frenziedly eager to take part in great events, that though he was very young at the time of the Battle of Marathon, when the country rang with the praises of the generalship of Miltiades, he was often to be seen buried in thought, passing sleepless nights and refusing invitations to wine parties, and that he answered those who asked him the cause of his change of habits, that the trophies of Miltiades would not let him sleep. Other men thought that the victory of Marathon had put an end to the war, but Themistocles saw that it was but the prelude to a greater contest, in which he prepared himself to stand forth as the champion of Greece, and, foreseeing long before what was to come, endeavored to make the city of Athens ready to meet it. First of all, he had the courage to propose that the Athenians, instead of dividing amongst themselves the revenues derived from the silver mines at Laurium, should construct ships out of this fund for the war with Aegina. This was then at its height, and the Aeginetans, who had a large navy, were masters of the sea. By this means Themistocles was more easily enabled to carry his point, not trying to terrify the people by alluding to Darius and the Persians, who lived a long way off, and whom few feared would ever come to attack them, but by cleverly appealing to their feelings of patriotism against the Aeginetans, to make them consent to the outlay. With that money 100 triremes were built, which were subsequently used to fight against Xerxes. After this he kept gradually turning the thoughts of the Athenians in the direction of the sea, because their land force was unable even to hold its own against the neighboring states, while with a powerful fleet they could both beat off the barbarians and make themselves masters of the whole of Greece. Thus, as Plato says, instead of stationary soldiers as they were, he made them roving sailors, and gave rise to the contemptuous remark that Themistocles took away from the citizens of Athens the shield and the spear, and reduced them to the oar and the rower's bench. This, we are told by Stesimbrotus, he effected after quelling the opposition of Miltiades, who spoke on the other side. Whether his proceedings at this time were strictly constitutional or no I shall leave to others to determine, but that the only safety of Greece lay in its fleet, and that those triremes were the salvation of the Athenians after their city was taken, can be proved by the testimony, among others, of Xerxes himself, for although his land force was unbroken, he fled after his naval defeat, as though no longer able to contend with the Greeks, and he left Mardonius behind more to prevent pursuit, in my opinion, than with any hopes of conquest. Some writers tell us that he was a keen man of business, and explain that his grand style of living made this necessary, for he made costly sacrifices, and entertained foreigners in a splendid manner, all of which required a large expenditure, but some accuse him of meanness and avarice, and even say that he sold presents which were sent for his table. When Philides the horse dealer refused to sell him a colt, he threatened that he would soon make a wooden horse of the man's house, meaning that he would stir up lawsuits and claims against him from some of his relations. In ambition he surpassed every one. When yet a young and unknown man he prevailed upon Epicles of Hermione, the admired performer on the harp, to practice his art in his house, hoping thereby to bring many people to it to listen. And he displeased the Greeks when he went to the Olympian games by vying with Cimon in the luxury of his table, his tents, and his other furniture. It was thought very proper for Cimon, a young man of noble birth, to do so, but for a man who had not yet made himself a reputation, and had not means to support the expense, such extravagance seemed mere vulgar ostentation. In the dramatic contest, which even then excited great interest and rivalry, the play whose expenses he paid for won the prize. He put up a tablet in memory of his success bearing the words, Themistocles of Phryne was courageous, Phrynicus wrote the play, Adimantus was archon. Yet he was popular, for he knew every one of the citizens by name, and gave impartial judgment in all cases referred to him as arbitrator. Once, when Simonides of Chios asked him to strain a point in his favor, Themistocles, who was a general at the time, answered that Simonides would be a bad poet if he sang out of tune, and he would be a bad magistrate if he favored men against the law. At another time he rallied Simonides on his folly in abusing the Corinthians, who inhabited so fine a city, and in having his own statue carved, though he was so ugly. He continued to increase in popularity by judiciously courting the favor of the people, and was at length able to secure the triumph of his own party, and the banishment of his rival Aristides. As the Persians were now about to invade Greece, the Athenians deliberated as to who should be their leader. It is said that most men refused the post of general through fear, but that Epicides, the son of Euphamides, a clever mob orator, but cowardly and accessible to bribes, desired to be appointed, and seemed very likely to be elected. Themistocles, fearing that the state would be utterly ruined if its affairs fell into such hands, bribed him into forgetting his ambitious designs, and withdrawing his candidature. He was much admired for his conduct when envoys came from the Persian king to demand earth and water, in token of submission. He seized the interpreter, and by a decree of the people had him put to death, because he had dared to translate the commands of a barbarian into the language of free Greeks. He acted in the same way to Artemisius of Zelia. This man, at the instance of Themistocles, was declared infamous, he and his children and his descendants forever, because he brought Persian gold among the Greeks. His greatest achievement of all, however, was that he put an end to all the internal wars in Greece, and reconciled the states with one another, inducing them to defer the settlement of their feuds until after the Persian War. In this he is said to have been greatly assisted by Chilion the Arcadian. On his appointment as general, he at once endeavored to prevail upon his countrymen to man their fleet, leave their city, and go to meet the enemy by sea as far from Greece as possible. As this met with great opposition, he, together with the Lacedaemonians, led a large force as far as the Vale of Tempe, which they intended to make their first line of defense, as Thessaly had not at that time declared for the Persians. When, however, the armies were forced to retire from thence, and all Greece, up to Boeotia, declared for the Persians, the Athenians became more willing to listen to Themistocles about fighting by sea, and he was sent with a fleet to guard the straits at Artemisium. Here the Greeks chose the Lacedaemonians, and their general, Eurybides, to take the command, but the Athenians refused to submit to any other state, because they alone furnished more ships than all the rest. Themistocles, at this crisis perceiving the danger, gave up his claims to Eurybides, and soothed the wounded pride of the Athenians, telling them that if they proved themselves brave men in the war, they would find that all the other states in Greece would cheerfully recognize their supremacy. On this account he seems more than anyone else to deserve the credit of having saved Greece, and to have covered the Athenians with glory by teaching them to surpass their enemies in bravery, and their allies in good sense. When the Persian fleet reached Aphatai, Eurybides was terrified at the number of ships at the mouth of the straits, and, learning that 200 sail more were gone round the outside of Euboea to take him in the rear, he at once wished to retire further into Greece, and support the fleet by the land army in Peloponnesus, for he regarded the Persian king's fleet as utterly irresistible at sea. Upon this the Euboeans, who feared to be deserted by the Greeks, sent one Pelagon with a large sum of money, to make secret proposals to Themistocles. He took the money, Herodotus tells us, and gave it to Eurybides and his party. One of those who most vehemently opposed him was Architeles, the captain of the sacred trireme, who had not sufficient money to pay his crew, and therefore wished to sail back to Athens. Themistocles stirred up the anger of his men to such a pitch that they rushed upon him and took away his supper. At this, Architeles was much vexed, but Themistocles sent him a basket containing bread and meat, with a talent of silver hidden underneath it, with a message bidding him eat his supper and pay his men the next day, but that, if he did not, Themistocles would denounce him to his countrymen as having received bribes from the enemy. This we are told by Phanias of Lesbos. The battles which took place in the straits with the Persian ships were indeed indecisive, but the experience gained in them was of the greatest value to the Greeks, as they were taught by their result that multitudes of ships and splendid ensigns, and the boastful war cries of barbarians, avail nothing against men who dare to fight hand to hand, and that they must disregard all these and boldly grapple with their enemies. Pindar seems to have understood this when he says, about the battle at Artemisium, that there the sons of Athena laid their freedom's grand foundation. For indeed confidence leads to victory. This Artemisium is a promontory of the island of Euboea, stretching northwards beyond Hestia, and opposite to it is Olizon, which was once part of the dominions of Philoctetes. There is upon it a small temple of Artemis, Diana, which is called the Temple towards the east. Round it stand trees and a circle of pillars of white stone. This stone, when rubbed in the hand, has the color and smell of saffron. On one of these pillars were written the following verses. The sons of Athens once o'ercame in fight all Asia's tribes, on yonder sea. They raised these pillars round Diana's shrine, to thank her for their victory. Even now a place is pointed out on the beach where, under a great heap of sand, there is a deep bed of black ashes where it is thought the wrecks and dead bodies were burned. But when the news of Thermopylae was brought to the Greeks at Artemisium, that Leonidas had fallen, and Xerxes was in possession of the passes, they retired further into Greece, the Athenians protecting the rear on account of their bravery, and full of pride at their achievements. At all the harbors and landing places along the coast, Themistocles, as he passed by, cut conspicuous inscriptions on stones, some of which he found on the spot, and others which he himself set up at all the watering places and convenient stations for ships. In these inscriptions he besought the Ionians, if possible, to come over to the Athenians, who were their fathers, and who were fighting for their liberty, and if they could not do this, to throw the barbarian army into confusion during battle. He hoped that these writings would either bring the Ionians over to the side of the Greeks, or make them suspected of treason by the Persians. Meanwhile Xerxes invaded Greece through Doris, and came into Phocis, where he burned the city of the Phocians. The Greeks made no resistance, although the Athenians begged them to make a stand in Boeotia, and cover Attica, urging that they had fought in defense of the whole of Greece at Artemisium. However, as no one would listen to them, but all the rest of the Greeks determined to defend the Peloponnesus, and were collecting all their forces within it, and building a wall across the isthmus from sea to sea, the Athenians were enraged at their treachery, and disheartened at being thus abandoned to their fate. They had no thoughts of resisting so enormous an army, and the only thing they could do under the circumstances, to abandon their city and trust to their ships, was distasteful to the people, who saw nothing to be gained by victory, and no advantage in life, if they had to desert the temples of their gods and the monuments of their fathers. At this crisis, Themistocles, despairing of influencing the populace by human reasoning, just as a dramatist has recourse to supernatural machinery, produced signs and wonders and oracles. He argued that it was important that the sacred snake during those days deserted his usual haunt. The priests, who found their daily offerings to him of the first fruits of the sacrifices left untouched, told the people, at the instigation of Themistocles, that the goddess Athena, Minerva, had left the city, and was leading them to the sea. He also swayed the popular mind by the oracle, in which he argued that by wooden walls ships were alluded to, and that Apollo spoke of Salamis as divine, not terrible or sad, because Salamis would be the cause of great good fortune to the Greeks. Having thus gained his point, he proposed a decree, that the city be left to the care of the tutelary goddess of the Athenians, that all able-bodied men should embark in the ships of war, and that each man should take the best measures in his power to save the women and children and slaves. When this decree was passed, most of the Athenians sent their aged folks and women over to Troezen, where they were hospitably received by the Troezenians, who decreed that they should be maintained at the public expense, receiving each 2 obols a day, that the children should be allowed to pick the fruit from any man's tree, and even that their school expenses should be paid. This decree was proposed by Nicagoras. The Athenians at this time had no public funds, yet Aristotle tells us that the Senate of the Areopagus, by supplying each fighting man with 8 drachmas, did good service in manning the fleet, and Clydemus tells us that this money was obtained by an artifice of Themistocles. When the Athenians were going down to the Piraeus, he gave out that the Gorgon's head had been lost from the statue of the goddess. Themistocles, under pretext of seeking for it, searched every man, and found great stores of money hidden in their luggage, which he confiscated, and thus was able to supply the crews of the ships with abundance of necessaries. When the whole city put to sea, the sight affected some to pity, while others admired their courage in sending their families out of the way that they might not be disturbed by weeping and wailing as they went over to Salamis. Yet many of the aged citizens who were left behind at Athens afforded a piteous sight, and even the domestic animals, as they ran howling to the seashore, accompanying their masters, touched men's hearts. It is said that the dog of Xanthippus, the father of Pericles, could not endure to be separated from him, and jumping into the sea swam alongside of his trireme, reached Salamis, and then at once died. His tomb is even now to be seen at the place called Kynosema. Besides these great achievements, Themistocles, perceiving that his countrymen longed to have Aristides back again, and fearing that he might ally himself with the Persian, and work ruin to Greece out of anger against his own country, for Aristides had been banished from Athens before the war when Themistocles came into power, proposed a decree, that any citizen who had been banished for a term of years, might return and do his best by word and deed to serve his country together with the other citizens. Eurybides, on account of the prestige of Sparta, held the chief command of the fleet, but was unwilling to risk a battle, preferring to weigh anchor and sail to the isthmus where the land army of the Peloponnesians was assembled. This project was opposed by Themistocles, and it was on this occasion that he made use of the following well-known saying, when Eurybides said to him, "Themistocles, in the public games they whip those who rise before their turn." "True," said Themistocles, "but they do not crown those who lag behind." And when Eurybides raised his staff as if he would strike him, Themistocles said, "Strike, but hear me." When Eurybides, in wonder at his gentle temper, bade him speak, he again urged Eurybides to remain at Salamis. Someone then said that a man without a city had no right to tell those who still possessed one to abandon it, but Themistocles, turning upon him, answered, "Wretch, we Athenians have indeed abandoned our walls and houses, because we scorn to be slaves for the sake of mere buildings, but we have the greatest city of all Greece, our 200 ships of war, which now are ready to help you if you choose to be saved by their means. But if you betray us and leave us, some of the Greeks will soon learn to their cost that the Athenians have obtained a free city and a territory no worse than that which they left behind." When Eurybides heard Themistocles use this language, he began to fear that the Athenians might really sail away and leave him. When Eretrias tried to say something to Themistocles, he answered, "Do you too dare to say anything about war, you, who like a cuttlefish, have a sword but no heart?" It is said by some writers that while Themistocles was talking about these matters upon the deck of his ship, an owl was seen to fly from the right-hand side of the fleet, and to perch upon his mast, which omen encouraged all the Athenians to fight. But when the Persian host poured down to Phalerum, covering the whole seashore, and the king himself was seen with all his forces, coming down to the beach with the infantry, the Greeks forgot the words of Themistocles, and began to cast eager glances towards the isthmus and to be angry with anyone who proposed to do anything else than withdraw. They determined to retire by night, and the steersmen were given orders to prepare for a voyage. Themistocles, enraged at the idea of the Greek fleet dispersing, and losing the advantage of the narrow waters, planned the affair of Sicinus. This Sicinus was a Persian who had been taken prisoner, and who was fond of Themistocles and took charge of his children. He sent this man secretly to Xerxes, ordering him to say that Themistocles, the general of the Athenians, has determined to come over to the king of the Persians, and is the first to tell him that the Greeks are about to retreat. He bids him not to allow them to fly, but to attack them while they are disheartened at not being supported by a land force, and destroy their fleet. Xerxes, who imagined this to be said for his advantage, was delighted, and at once gave orders to the commanders of his ships to make ready for battle at their leisure, all but 200, whom he ordered to put to sea at once, surround the whole strait, and close up the passages through the islands, so that no one of the enemy could escape. While this was being done, Aristides, the son of Lysimachus, who was the first to perceive it, came to the tent of Themistocles, although the latter was his enemy, and had driven him into exile. When Themistocles came to meet him, he told him they were surrounded. Knowing the frank and noble character of Aristides, Themistocles told him the whole plot, and begged him as a man in whom the Greeks could trust, to encourage them to fight a battle in the straits. Aristides praised Themistocles for what he had done, and went round to the other generals and captains of ships, inciting them to fight. Yet they were inclined to doubt even the word of Aristides, when a trireme from the island of Tenos, under the command of Panaretios, came in, having deserted from the enemy, and brought the news that the Greeks were really surrounded. Then, in a spirit of anger and despair, they prepared for the struggle. At daybreak Xerxes took his seat on a high cliff overlooking all his host, just above the temple of Heracles, we are told by Phanidemus, where the strait between Salamis and Attica is narrowest, but according to Acestodorus, close to the Megarian frontier, upon the mountains called Horns. Here he sat upon the golden throne, with many scribes standing near, whose duty it was to write down the events of the battle. While Themistocles was sacrificing on the beach, beside the admiral's ship, 3 most beautiful captive boys were brought to him, splendidly adorned with gold and fine clothes. They were said to be the children of Sandorc, the sister of Xerxes, and Artemisius. When Euphrantides the prophet saw them, there shone at once from the victims on the altar a great and brilliant flame, and at the same time someone was heard to sneeze on the right hand, which is a good omen. Euphrantides now besought Themistocles to sacrifice these young men as victims to Dionysus, to whom human beings are sacrificed, so should the Greeks obtain safety and victory. Themistocles was struck with horror at this terrible proposal, but the multitude, who, as is natural with people in great danger, hoped to be saved by miraculous rather than by ordinary means, called upon the god with one voice, and leading the captives up to the altar, compelled him to offer them up as the prophet bade him. This story rests on the authority of Phanias of Lesbos, who was a man of education, and well read in history. As for the numbers of the Persian fleet, the poet Aeschylus, as though he knew it clearly, writes as follows in his tragedy of the Persi. And well I know 1,000 sail. That day did Xerxes meet. And 700 more. The fastest of his fleet. The Athenian ships, 180 in number, had each 18 men on deck, 4 of whom were archers, and the rest heavy-armed soldiers. Themistocles now chose the time for the battle as judiciously as he had chosen the place, and would not bring his triremes into line of battle before the fresh wind off the sea, as is usual in the morning, raised a heavy swell in the straits. This did not damage the low flat ships of the Greeks, but it caught the high-stern Persian ships, overweighted as they were with lofty decks, and presented their broadsides to the Greeks, who eagerly attacked them, watching Themistocles because he was their best example, and also because Artemisius, Xerxes's admiral, and the bravest and best of the king's brothers, attacked him in a huge ship, from which, as if from a castle, he poured darts and arrows upon him. But Amanias of Decelea and Socles of Pegia, who were both sailing in the same vessel, met him stem to stem. Each ship crashed into the other with its iron beak, and was torn open. Artemisius attempted to board the Greek ship, but these two men set upon him with their spears, and drove him into the sea. His body was noticed by Queen Artemisia floating amongst the other wreckage, and was by her brought to Xerxes. At this period of the battle it is said that a great light was seen to shine from Eleusis, and that a great noise was heard upon the Thriasian plain near the sea, as though multitudes of men were escorting the mystic Iacchus in procession. From the place where these sounds were heard a mist seemed to spread over the sea and envelop the ships. Others thought that they saw spirit forms of armed men come from Aegina, and hold their hands before the ships of the Greeks. These it was supposed were the Aeacid heroes, to whom prayers for help had been offered just before the battle. The first man to capture a ship was Lycomedes, an Athenian captain, who cut off its ensign and dedicated it to Apollo with the laurel crown at the temple at Phliae. In the narrow straits the Persians were unable to bring more than a part of their fleet into action, and their ships got into each other's way, so that the Greeks could meet them on equal terms, and, although they resisted until evening, completely routed them, winning, as Simonides calls it, that glorious and famous victory, the greatest exploit ever achieved at sea, which owed its success to the bravery of the sailors and the genius of Themistocles. After this naval defeat, Xerxes, enraged at his failure, endeavored to fill up the strait with earth, and so to make a passage for his land forces to Salamis, to attack the Greeks there. Now Themistocles, in order to try the temper of Aristides, proposed that the fleet should sail to the Hellespont, and break the bridge of boats there, in order, said he, that we may conquer Asia in Europe. But Aristides disapproved of this measure, saying, "Hitherto we have fought against the Persian king, while he has been at his ease, but if we shut him up in Greece, and drive the chief of so large an army to despair, he will no longer sit quietly under a golden umbrella to look on at his battles, but will strain every nerve and superintend every operation in person, and so will easily retrieve his losses and form better plans for the future." Instead of breaking down the existing bridge for him, Themistocles, said he, "We ought rather, if possible, at once to build another, and send the man out of Europe as quickly as possible." "Well then," answered Themistocles, "if you think that our interest lies in that direction, we ought all to consider and contrive to send him out of Greece as fast as we can." When this resolution was adopted, Themistocles sent one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had found among the prisoners, bidding him warn Xerxes that the Greeks had determined after their victory to sail to the Hellespont and break the bridge, but that Themistocles, out of his regard for the king, advises him to proceed as fast as he can to his own sea, and cross over it, while he, Themistocles, gained time for him by delaying the allied fleet. Xerxes, hearing thus, was much alarmed and retired in all haste. And indeed the battle with Mardonius at Plataea shows us which of the two was right, for the Greeks there could scarcely deal with a small part of the Persian army, and what therefore could they have done with the whole? Herodotus tells us that, of Greek states, Aegina received the prize of valor, and that, of the generals, it was awarded to Themistocles, though against the will of the voters. When the armies retired to the isthmus all the generals laid their votes on the altar there, and each man declared himself to deserve the first prize for valor, and Themistocles to deserve the second. However, the Lacedaemonians brought him home with them to Sparta, and gave Eurybiades the first prize for valor, but Themistocles that for wisdom, a crown of olive leaves. They also gave him the best chariot in their city, and sent 300 of their young men to escort him out of the country. It is also related that at the next Olympian Games, when Themistocles appeared upon the race course, all the spectators took no further interest in the contests, but passed the whole day in admiring and applauding him, and in pointing him out to such as were strangers, so that he was delighted, and said to his friends that he had now received his reward for all his labors on behalf of Greece. He was by nature excessively fond of admiration, as we may judge from the stories about him which have been preserved. Once, when he was made admiral of the Athenian fleet, he put off all the necessary business of his office until the day appointed for sailing, in order that he might have a great many dealings with various people all at once, and so appear to be a person of great influence and importance. And when he saw the corpses floating in the sea with gold bracelets and necklaces, he himself passed them by, but pointed them out to a friend who was following, saying, "Do you pick them up and keep them, for you are not Themistocles." A beautiful youth, named Antiphates, regarded him coolly at first, but eventually became submissive to him because of his immense reputation. "Young man," said Themistocles, "it has taken some time, but we have at length both regained our right minds." He used to say that the Athenians neither admired nor respected him, but used him like a plane tree under which they took shelter in storm, but which in fair weather they lopped and stripped of its leaves. Once when a citizen of Serepho said to him that he owed his glory, not to himself but to his city, he answered, "Very true, I should not have become a great man if I had been a Serephian, nor would you if you had been an Athenian." When one of his fellow generals, who thought that he had done the state good service, was taking a haughty tone, and comparing his exploits with those of Themistocles, he said, "The day after a feast, once upon a time, boasted that it was better than the feast day itself, because on that day all men are full of anxiety and trouble, while upon the next day every one enjoys what has been prepared at his leisure." But the feast day answered, "Very true, only but for me you never would have been at all." "So now," said he, "if I had not come first, where would you all have been now?" His son, who was spoiled by his mother, and by himself to please her, he said was the most powerful person in Greece, for the Athenians ruled the Greeks, he ruled the Athenians, his wife ruled him, and his son ruled his wife. Wishing to be singular in all things, when he put up a plot of ground for sale, he ordered the crier to announce that there were good neighbors next to it. When two men paid their addresses to his daughter, he chose the more agreeable instead of the richer of the two, saying that he preferred a man without money to money without a man. Such was his character, as shown in his talk. Immediately after the Great War, he began to rebuild and fortify the city. In order to succeed in this, Theopompus says that he bribed the Spartan ephors into laying aside opposition, but most writers say that he outwitted them by proceeding to Sparta nominally on an embassy. Then when the Spartans complained to him that Athens was being fortified, and when Polyarchus came expressly from Aegina to charge him with it, he denied it, and bade them send commissioners to Athens to see whether it was true, wishing both to obtain time for the fortifications to be built, and also to place these commissioners in the hands of the Athenians, as hostages for his own safety. His expectations were realized, for the Lacedaemonians, on discovering the truth, did him no harm, but dissembled their anger and sent him away. After this he built Piraeus, as he perceived the excellence of its harbors, and was desirous to turn the whole attention of the Athenians to naval pursuits. In this he pursued a policy exactly the opposite to that of the ancient kings of Attica, for they are said to have endeavored to keep their subjects away from the sea, and to accustom them to till the ground instead of going on board ships, quoting the legend that Athene and Poseidon had a contest for the possession of the land, and that she gained a decision in her favor by the production of the sacred olive. Themistocles, on the other hand, did not so much stick Piraeus onto Athens, as Aristophanes the comic poet said, as make the city dependent upon Piraeus, and the land dependent on the sea. By this means he transferred power from the nobles to the people, because sailors and pilots became the real strength of the state. For this reason the 30 tyrants destroyed the bema, or tribune on the place of public assembly, which was built looking towards the sea, and built another which looked inland, because they thought that the naval supremacy of Athens had been the origin of its democratic constitution, and that an oligarchy had less to fear from men who cultivated the land. Themistocles had even more extended views than these about making the Athenians supreme at sea. When Xerxes was gone, the whole Greek fleet was drawn up on shore for the winter at Pegasae. Themistocles then publicly told the Athenians that he had a plan which would save and benefit them all, but which must not be divulged. The Athenians bade him tell Aristides only, and to execute his designs if he approved. Themistocles then told Aristides that his design was to burn the whole Greek fleet as they lay on the beach. But Aristides came forward and told the people that no proposal could be more advantageous or more villainous, so that the Athenians forbade Themistocles to proceed with it. On another occasion the Lacedaemonians proposed, in a meeting of the Amphictyonic Council, that all states that had taken no part in the Persian War should be excluded from that council. Themistocles, fearing that if the Lacedaemonians should exclude Thessaly, Argos, and Thebes, they would have complete control over the votes, and be able to carry what measures they pleased, made representations to the various states, and influenced the votes of their deputies at the meeting, pointing out to them that there were only 31 states which took any part in the war, and that most of these were very small ones, so that it would be unreasonable for one or two powerful states to pronounce the rest of Greece outlawed, and be supreme in the council. After this he generally opposed the Lacedaemonians, wherefore they paid special court to Cimon, in order to establish him as a political rival to Themistocles. Moreover, he made himself odious to the allies by sailing about the islands and wringing money from them. A case in point is the conversation which Herodotus tells us he held with the people of Andros, when trying to get money from them. He said that he was come, bringing with him two gods, persuasion and necessity, but they replied that they also possessed two equally powerful ones, poverty and helplessness, by whom they were prevented from supplying him with money. The poet, Timocrian of Rhodes, in one of his songs, writes bitterly of Themistocles, saying that he was prevailed upon by the bribes which he received from exiles to restore them to their native country, but abandoned himself, who was his guest and friend. The song runs as follows. Though ye may sing Pausanias or Xanthippus in your lays, or Leotychides, 'tis Aristides whom I praise, the best of men as yet produced by holy Athens state. Since thus upon Themistocles has fallen Latona's hate, that liar and that traitor base, who for a bribe unclean refused to reinstate a man who his own guest had been, his friend too, in his native Ialysus, but who took 3 silver talents with him, and his friend forsook. Bad luck go with the fellow, who unjustly some restores from exile, while some others he had banished from our shores. And some he puts to death, and sits among us gorged with pelf. He kept an ample table at the Isthmian games himself, and gave to every guest that came full plenty of cold meat, the which they with a prayer did each and every of them eat. But their prayer was next year be there no Themistocles to meet. And after the exile and condemnation of Themistocles, Timocrian wrote much more abusively about him in a song which begins, Muse, far away, sound this my lay, for it both meet and right is. It is said that Timocrian was exiled from home for having dealings with the Persians, and that Themistocles confirmed his sentence. When, then, Themistocles was charged with intriguing with the Persians, Timocrian wrote upon him, Timocrian is not the only Greek that turned a traitor, Persian gold to seek. I'm not the only fox without a tail, but others put their honor up for sale. As the Athenians, through his unpopularity, eagerly listened to any story to his discredit, he was obliged to weary them by constantly repeating the tale of his own exploits to them. In answer to those who were angry with him, he would ask, Are you weary of always receiving benefits from the same hand? He also vexed the people by building the temple of Artemis of Good Counsel, as he called her, hinting that he had taken good counsel for the Greeks. This temple he placed close to his own house in Melite, at the place where at the present day the public executioner casts out the bodies of executed criminals, and the clothes and ropes of men who have hanged themselves. Even in our own times a small statue of Themistocles used to stand in the temple of Artemis of Good Counsel, and he seems to have been a hero not only in mind, but in appearance. The Athenians made use of ostracism to banish him, in order to reduce his extravagant pretensions, as they always were wont to do in the case of men whom they thought overpowerful and unfit for living in the equality of a democracy. For ostracism implied no censure, but was intended as a vent for envious feelings, which were satisfied by seeing the object of their hatred thus humbled. When Themistocles was banished from Athens, he lived in Argos, during which time the proceedings of Pausanias gave a great opportunity to his enemies. He was impeached on a charge of treason by Leobotes, the son of Alcmaeon of Agraulae, and the Spartans joined in the impeachment. Pausanias, indeed, at first concealed his treacherous designs from Themistocles, although he was his friend, but when he saw that Themistocles was banished, and chafing at the treatment he had received, he was encouraged to ask him to share his treason, and showed him the letters which he had received from the Persian king, at the same time inflaming his resentment against the Greeks, whom he spoke of as ungrateful wretches. Themistocles refused utterly to join Pausanias, but nevertheless told no one of his treasonable practices, either because he hoped that he would desist, or that his visionary and impossible projects would be disclosed by other means. And thus it was that when Pausanias was put to death, certain letters and writings on this subject were found, which threw suspicion upon Themistocles. The Lacedaemonians loudly condemned him, and many of his own countrymen, because of the enmity they bore him, brought charges against him. He did not appear in person at first, but answered these attacks by letters. In these he told his accusers that he had always sought to rule, and was not born to obey, so that he never would sell himself and Greece to be a slave to the Persians. But in spite of these arguments, his enemies prevailed upon the Athenians to send men with orders to seize him, and bring him to be tried by Greece. He was apprised of this in time to take refuge in Corcyra, a state which was under obligations to him. For once, when Corcyra was at variance with Corinth, he had been chosen to arbitrate between them, and had reconciled them, giving as his award that the Corinthians were to pay down 20 talents, and each state to have an equal share in the city and island of Leucas, as being a colony from both of them. From thence he fled to Epirus, but, being still pursued by the Athenians and Lacedaemonians, he adopted a desperate resolution. Admetus, the king of the Molossians, had once made some request to the Athenians, which Themistocles, who was then in the height of his power, insultingly refused to grant. Admetus was deeply incensed, and eager for vengeance, but now Themistocles feared the fresh fury of his countrymen more than this old grudge of the king's, put himself at his mercy, and became a suppliant to Admetus in a novel and strained fashion, for he lay down at the hearth of Admetus, holding that prince's infant son, which is considered among the Molossians to be the most solemn manner of becoming a suppliant, and one which cannot be refused. Some say that Thyia, the king's wife, suggested this posture to Themistocles, and placed her infant on the hearth with him, while others say that Admetus, in order to be able to allege religious reasons for his refusal to give up Themistocles to his pursuers, himself arranged the scene with him. After this, Epicrates, of the township of Achanae, managed to convey his wife and children out of Athens to join him, for which, we are told by Stesimbrotus, Cimon subsequently had him condemned and executed. But, singularly enough, afterwards Stesimbrotus either forgets his wife and children, or makes Themistocles forget them, when he says that he sailed to Sicily and demanded the daughter of the despot Hiero in marriage, promising that he would make all Greece obey him. As Hiero rejected his proposals, he then went to Asia. Now it is not probable that this ever took place. Theophrastus, in his treatise on monarchy, relates that when Hiero sent racehorses to Olympia and pitched a costly tent there, Themistocles said to the assembled Greeks that they ought to destroy the despot's tent, and not permit his horses to run. Thucydides too informs us that he crossed to the Aegean Sea, and set sail from Pydna, none of his fellow travelers knowing who he was until the ship was driven by contrary winds to Naxos, which was then being besieged by the Athenians. Then he became alarmed, and told the captain and the pilot who he was, and, partly by entreaties, partly by threats that he would denounce them to the Athenians, and say that they well knew who he was, but were carrying him out of the country for a bribe, he prevailed on them to hold on their course to the coast of Asia. Of his property, much was concealed by his friends and sent over to him in Asia, but what was confiscated to the public treasury amounted, according to Theopompus, to 100 talents, and according to Theophrastus to 80, albeit Themistocles, before his entrance into political life, did not possess property worth 3 talents. When he sailed to Kyme, he found that many of the inhabitants of the Ionic coast were watching for an opportunity to capture him, especially Ergoteles and Pythodorus, for indeed, to men who cared not how they made their money, he would have been a rich prize, as the Persian king had offered a reward of 200 talents for him. He fled to Aegae, a little Aeolian city, where he was known by no one except his friend Nicogenes, the richest of all the Aeolians, who was well known to the Persians of the interior. In this man's house he lay concealed for some days. Here, after the feast which followed a sacrifice, Albius, who took charge of Nicogenes' children, fell into a kind of inspired frenzy, and spoke the following verse. Night shall speak and give thee counsel, night shall give thee victory. After this Themistocles dreamed a dream. He thought that a snake was coiling itself upon his belly and crawling up towards his throat. As soon as it reached his throat, it became an eagle and flapped its wings, lifted him up, and carried him a long distance, until he saw a golden herald staff. The eagle set him down upon this securely, and he felt free from all terror and anxiety. After this he was sent away by Nicogenes, who made use of the following device. Most barbarian nations, and the Persians especially, are violently jealous in their treatment of women. They guard not only their wives, but their purchased slaves and concubines, with the greatest care, not permitting them to be seen by anyone out of doors, but when they are at home they lock them up, and when they are on a journey they place them in wagons with curtains all round them. Such a wagon was prepared for Themistocles, and he travelled in it, his escort telling all whom they met that they were conveying a Greek lady from Ionia to one of the king's courtiers. Thucydides and Charon of Lampsacus relate that Xerxes was now dead, and that Themistocles gave himself up to his son, but Ephorus, Danon, Clitarchus, Heraclides, and many others, say that it was to Xerxes himself that he came. But the narrative of Thucydides agrees better with the dates, although they are not thoroughly settled. At this perilous crisis Themistocles first applied to Artabanus, a chiliarch, or officer in command of a regiment of 1,000 men, whom he told that he was a Greek, and that he wished to have an interview with the king about matters of the utmost importance, and in which the king was especially interested. He replied, "Stranger, the customs of different races are different, and each has its own standard of right and wrong, yet among all men it is thought right to honor, admire, and to defend one's own customs. Now we are told that you chiefly prize freedom and equality. We on the other hand think it the best of all our laws to honor the king, and to worship him as we should worship the statue of a god that preserves us all. Wherefore if you are come with the intention of adopting our customs, and of prostrating yourself before the king, you may be permitted to see the king, and speak with him, but if not, you must use some other person to communicate with him, for it is not the custom for the king to converse with any one who does not prostrate himself before him." Themistocles, hearing this, said to him, "Artabanus, I am come to increase the glory and power of the king, and will both myself adopt your customs, since the god that has exalted the Persians will have it so, and will also increase the number of those who prostrate themselves before the king. So let this be no impediment to the interview with him which I desire." "Whom of the Greeks," asked Artabanus, "are we to tell him is come? For you do not seem to have the manners of a man of humble station." "No one," answered Themistocles, "must learn my name before the king himself." This is the story which we are told by Phanias. But Eratosthenes, in his treatise on wealth, tells us also that Themistocles was introduced to Artabanus by an Eretrian lady with whom the latter lived. When he was brought into the king's presence he prostrated himself, and stood silent. The king then told his interpreter to ask him who he was, and when the interpreter had asked this question, he told him to answer, "I am, O king, Themistocles the Athenian, an exile, a man who has wrought much evil to the Persians, but more good than evil, in that I stopped the pursuit when Greece was safe, and I was able to do you a kindness as all was well at home. In my present fallen fortunes I am prepared to be grateful for any mark of favor you may show me, or to deprecate your anger, should you bear a grudge against me. You may see, from the violence of my own countrymen against me, how great were the benefits which I conferred upon the Persians, so now use me rather as a means of proving your magnanimity than of glutting your wrath. Wherefore save me, your suppliant, and do not destroy one who has become the enemy of Greece." Themistocles also introduced a supernatural element into his speech by relating the vision which he saw at the house of Nicogenes, and also a prophecy which he received at the shrine of Jupiter of Dodona, which bade him go to the namesake of the god, from which he concluded that the god sent him to the king, because they were both great, and called kings. To this speech the Persian king made no answer, although he was astonished at his bold spirit, but in conversation with his friends he spoke as though this were the greatest possible piece of good fortune, and in his prayers begged Arimaneos to make his enemies ever continue to banish their ablest men. He is said to have offered a sacrifice to the gods and to have drunk wine at once, and during the night in his soundest sleep he thrice cried out, "I have got Themistocles the Athenian." At daybreak he called together his friends and sent for Themistocles, who augured nothing pleasant from the insults and abuse which he received from the people at the palace gates, when they heard his name. Moreover Roxannes the chiliarch, as Themistocles passed by him in silence into the king's presence, whispered, "Thou subtle serpent of Greece, the king's good genius has led thee hither." But when he was come before the king and had prostrated himself a second time, the king embraced him, and said in a friendly tone that he already owed him 200 talents, for as he had brought himself he was clearly entitled to the reward which was offered to anyone else who would do so. He also promised him much more than this, and encouraged him to speak at length upon the affairs of Greece. To this Themistocles answered, that human speech was like embroidered tapestry, because when spread out it shows all its figures, but when wrapped up it both conceals and spoils them, wherefore he asked for time. The king was pleased with his simile, and bade him take what time he chose. He asked for a year, during which he learned the Persian language sufficiently to talk to the king without an interpreter. This led the people to imagine that he discoursed about the affairs of Greece, but many changes were made at that time in the great officers of the court, and the nobles disliked Themistocles, imagining that he dared to speak about them to the king. Indeed, he was honored as no other foreigner ever was, and went hunting with the king and lived in his family circle, so that he came into the presence of the king's mother, and became her intimate friend, and at the king's command was instructed in the mysteries of the Magi. When Demaratus the Spartan was bidden to ask for a boon, he asked to be allowed to drive through Sardis wearing his tiara upright like that of the king. Mithridates, the king's cousin, took hold of Demaratus by his tiara, saying, "You have no brains for the king's tiara to cover. Do you think you would become Zeus if you were given his thunderbolt to wield?" The king was very angry with Demaratus because of this request, but Themistocles by his entreaties restored him to favor. It is also said that the later Persian kings, whose politics were more mixed up with those of Greece, used to promise any Greek whom they wished to desert to them that they would treat him better than Themistocles. We are told that Themistocles himself, after he became a great man and was courted by many, was seated one day at a magnificent banquet, and said to his children, "My sons, we should have been ruined if it had not been for our ruin." Most writers agree that 3 cities, Magnesia, Lampsacus, and Myus, were allotted to him for bread, wine, and meat. To these needs of Cyzicus and Phanias add 2 more, Percote and Palariskepsis, which were to supply bedding and clothing respectively. On one occasion, when he went down to the seaside on some business connected with Greece, a Persian named Epixes, satrap of Upper Phrygia, plotted his assassination. He had long kept some Pisidians who were to kill him when he passed the night in the town of Leontocophilus, which means lion's head. It is said that the mother of the gods appeared to him while he was sleeping at noon and said, "Themistocles, be late at lion's head, lest you fall in with a lion. As a recompense for this warning, I demand Mnesiptolema for my handmaid." Themistocles, disturbed at this, after praying to the goddess, left the highway and made a circuit by another road, avoiding that place. When it was night he encamped in the open country. As one of the sumpter cattle that carried his tent had fallen into a river, Themistocles' servants hung up the rich hangings, which were dripping with wet, in order to dry them. The Pisidians meanwhile came up to the camp with drawn swords, and, not clearly distinguishing in the moonlight the things hung out to dry, thought that they must be the tent of Themistocles, and that they would find him asleep within it. When they came close to it and raised the hangings, the servants who were on the watch fell upon them and seized them. Having thus escaped from danger, he built a temple to Dindymene at Magnesia to commemorate the appearance of the goddess, and appointed his daughter Mnesiptolema to be its priestess. When he came to Sardis, he leisurely examined the temples and the offerings which they contained, and in the temple of the Mother of the Gods, he found a bronze female figure called the water carrier, about 2 cubits high, which he himself, when overseer of the water supply of Athens, had made out of the fines imposed upon those who took water illegally. Either feeling touched at the statue being a captive, or else willing to show the Athenians how much power he possessed in Persia, he proposed to the satrap of Lydia to send it back to Athens. This man became angry at his demand, and said that he should write to the king, and tell him of it. Themistocles in terror applied himself to the harem of the satrap, and by bribing the ladies there induced them to pacify him, while he himself took care to be more cautious in future, as he saw that he had to fear the enmity of the native Persians. For this reason, Theopompus tells us, he ceased to wander about Asia, but resided at Magnesia, where, receiving rich presents and honored equally with the greatest Persian nobles, he lived for a long time in tranquility, for the king's attention was so entirely directed to the affairs of the provinces of the interior that he had no leisure for operations against Greece. But when Egypt revolted, and the Athenians assisted it, and Greek triremes sailed as far as Cyprus and Cilicia, and Cimon was master of the sea, then the king determined to attack the Greeks, and prevent their development at his expense. Armies were put in motion, generals were appointed, and frequent messages were sent to Themistocles from the king, bidding him attack Greece and fulfill his promises. Themistocles, unmoved by resentment against his countrymen, and uninfluenced by the thought of the splendid position which he might occupy as commander-in-chief, possibly too, thinking that his task was an impossible one, as Greece possessed many great generals, especially Cimon, who had a most brilliant reputation, but chiefly because he would not soil his glory and disgrace the trophies which he had won, determined, as indeed was his best course, to bring his life to a fitting close. He offered sacrifice to the gods, called his friends together, and, having taken leave of them, drank bull's blood, according to the most common tradition, but according to others, some quickly operating poison, and died at Magnesia in the 65th year of a life almost entirely spent in great political and military employments. The king of Persia, when he heard of the manner of his death and his reasons for dying, admired him more than ever, and continued to treat his family and friends with kindness. Themistocles left 5 children, Neocles, Diocles, Archeptelis, Polyeuctus, Cleophantus, by his first wife Archippe, who was the daughter of Lysander, of the township of Alopicae. Of these Cleophantus is mentioned by Plato the philosopher as being an excellent horseman, but otherwise worthless. Of the elder ones, Neocles was bitten by a horse and died while still a child, and Diocles was adopted by his grandfather Lysander. He also had several daughters by his second wife, of whom Misiptalema married Archeptelis, her father's half-brother. Italia married Panthoides of the island of Chios, and Sybaris married Nicomedes, an Athenian. After Themistocles' death, his nephew Phrasicles sailed to Magnesia, and with her brother's consent married Nicomede, and also took charge of the youngest child, who was named Asia. The people of Magnesia show a splendid tomb of Themistocles in their marketplace, but with regard to the fate of his remains we must pay no attention to Andachides, who in his address to his friends, tells us that the Athenians stole them and tore them to pieces, because he would tell any fossa to excite the hatred of the nobles against the people. Philachus, too, writes his history in such dramatic form that he all but resorts to the actual machinery of the stage, bringing forward one Neocles and Demopolis as the children of Themistocles to make a touching scene, which anyone can see is untrue. Diodorus the topographer, in his treatise on tombs says, more as a conjecture than as knowing it for a fact, that in the great harbour of Piraeus a kind of elbow juts out from the promontory of Alcimus, and that when one sails past this, going inwards, where the sea is most sheltered, there is a large foundation, and upon it the tomb of Themistocles, shaped like an altar. It is thought that the comic poet Plato alludes to this in the following verses. By the sea's margin, by the watery strand, thy monument, Themistocles, shall stand. By this directed to thy native shore, the merchant shall convey his freighted store. And when our fleets are summoned to the fight, Athens shall conquer with thy tomb in sight. The descendants of Themistocles are given certain privileges at Magnesia even to the present day, for I know that Themistocles, an Athenian, my friend and fellow student in the school of Ammonius the philosopher, enjoyed them. Thank you for watching. Did you enjoy the life of Themistocles? If so, let us know in the comments, and be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons. See you next time.